You're listening to the free ad-sponsored re-release of American Election's Wicked Game, a weekly march through every presidential election from 1789 to 2024. To listen to all episodes right now, ad-free, go to intohistory.com. Subscribers there enjoy ad-free listening, early access, bonus content, and more from a growing collection of great history podcasts. Start your free trial today at intohistory.com. It's Thanksgiving Day, 1930, in Grand Rapids, Michigan. The South High School Trojans face off against their rival, the Union High School Redhawks. A blizzard and the near sub-zero temperature have not stopped 12,000 spectators from filling South Field to the brim. Snowdrifts are piled high on the sidelines, and the field has become a pit of mud and ice. It's late in the game, and the two undefeated teams are in a stalemate, tied 0-0 as they battle for the coveted state championship. The South High Trojans have the ball. It's been a tough grind through the swamp to midfield. The Trojan center, a boy named June, motions the team in. "Come on, boys, hustle to the huddle. Let's go, let's go." The Trojans are exhausted. Their hands are frozen, their bodies ache. But June sees that one player is still missing from the huddle, Alan Elliott, their quarterback. Where's Elliott? And just then, June notices Elliott is still down on the field. In the last play, he got hit hard. The 130-pound quarterback's forward motion sent him headfirst into a massive Redhawk defender. Elliott's leather helmet did little to cushion the blow. But soon Elliott is struggling to his feet and makes it over to the huddle. Elliott's head is spinning. "Elliott, you okay, bud? You hurt?" "Which one of the three of you is asking?" June laughs, but he knows his quarterback is in bad shape. Elliott can hardly walk. But the clock is ticking. The game is on the line. So June urges him on. "All right, buddy, what's the play?" "All right, let's go with..." Elliott trails off, struggles to find his words. June can see that his quarterback needs help. "I'm taking over, Elliott." No, I can't quit now. We got to win this." "I'm not asking you to quit. Just let me call the plays until you're good." "No, I can do this." "Elliott, do you trust me?" Quarterback can think of no one in the world he trusts more than June. "All right, June, you're in charge." For the remainder of the drive, the center calls the plays. With each down, June snaps the ball to one of the other backs and then puts all his might into protecting his quarterback from another hit. Though June and the Trojans fight valiantly to drive the ball further down the field, South High is again stopped just short of the end zone. When the game is ultimately called by the refs, the score is still 0-0. Though the epic face-off ended in a tie, it was later discovered that the Redhawks broke recruitment rules. One of their players was declared ineligible, and the Redhawks were forced to forfeit the game. As a result, June and the South High School Trojans were declared the 1930 Michigan State champions. And June, short for Gerald Ford Jr., was named All-State Center. The time Gerald Ford spent playing football would teach him valuable lessons he would carry with him throughout his entire life. He never forgot the words of his football mentor, Coach Gettings. "You play to win. You give it everything you've got, but you always play within the rules." From Airship, I'm Lindsey Graham, and this is American Election's Wicked Game. In 1972, incumbent Republican President Richard Nixon won re-election in a landslide. But the tactics used by his campaign to win the 1972 contest pulled Nixon into what is arguably the biggest political scandal of the 20th century, Watergate. When his vice president, Spiro Agnew, became wrapped up in a scandal of his own, the embattled White House needed help. In his hour of need, Nixon turned to an Eagle Scout with an untarnished reputation. With talks of impeachment looming, Nixon enlisted a politician he could trust to run the country, a man free and clear from political scandal, Gerald R. Ford Jr. Nixon hoped Ford would save him, but he also hoped he would play ball and remain loyal. in the midst of the Nixon maelstrom, Gerald Ford would become the only president to ever serve without having been elected as president or vice president. But Ford would have to prove himself worthy of the office. He would have to heal a hurting nation and gain the trust of the American voter. And he would have to face off in the Republican primary against a rising conservative star named Ronald Reagan. With a country tired of war and fed up with dirty politics, the election of 1976 would open the door for a Washington outsider to make a play for the White House, a Democratic candidate who had spent more time in the small town of Plains, Georgia than in Washington, former Georgia Governor Jimmy Carter. The election of 1976 would be a battle not only to gain the American people's votes, but to regain their trust. This is episode 48, 1976, Ford versus Carter, Unimpeachable. It's Sunday, June 18, 1972, at a hotel room in Newport Beach, California. The previous night, former Attorney General John Mitchell and his wife Martha spent the night at a Republican event called Celebrities for Nixon. Most Americans dream of rubbing shoulders with the likes of John Wayne, Zsa Zsa Gabor, and Governor Ronald Reagan. But last night put Martha Mitchell in a sour mood. Throughout the party, her husband avoided her. When she did manage to find him, he was having private conversations which abruptly stopped when she entered the room. So today, she thought she would finally have some alone time with him. But Martha's sour again because John is about to leave town. You're going back to Washington without me? Well, think of it as a vacation, Martha. Stay on here in California. Lay out. Get some sun. Don't pretend like this is relaxing for me, John. Today alone, there was a brunch, a cocktail party, a dinner. I'm exhausted. I want to go home. But the campaign needs you here. I need you here. Martha Mitchell, known as the Mouth of the South, has been an asset on the campaign trail. Nixon calls Martha his secret weapon. But her husband, John, the current chairman of Nixon's reelection campaign, calls Martha his unguided missile. She has infamously loose lips, and at the moment, this makes her a political liability. I feel like I'm the only one out on the road. Whenever Vice President Agnew doesn't want to do something, they call Martha Mitchell. I tell you I'm sick of it, John. Darling, hang on for 2 more months, and I promise you, after the election, I will take you back to New York, I'll practice law, and we'll get away from all of this. Don't say that to me if you don't mean it. It's all I want to. But things are happening right now, and I can't leave the campaign, not yet. I leave for Washington tomorrow. So today, let's just have some fun, okay? The next day, after John left for the airport, Martha saw the headline on the front page of the newspaper. Suspect in bugging of Democrat office found to be GOP worker. She saw a picture of James McCord, one of 5 men arrested for breaking into the Democratic National Headquarters at the Washington Hotel. Below the picture of McCord was a statement from her husband. He claimed the men were not operating either on behalf or with our consent. But Martha knew her husband was lying. Days later, she called reporter Helen Thomas of United Press International. But before Martha could blow the lid off Watergate, Thomas heard something disturbing on the other end of the line, sounds of a struggle. Martha screamed, "Get away," and then the line went dead. For Martha Mitchell, the end of the phone call on June 22, 1972, was the beginning of a nightmare. She says that when campaign security guard Steve King came into her room, she was undressed. He threw her on the bed and ripped the phone cord out of the wall. He locked her in her room, where she was held for days against her will. During multiple escape attempts, she was kicked, struck, and abused. She was even injected with a sedative against her will. All because Martha Mitchell knew the truth about Watergate. She knew it was a cover-up that went all the way to the top. Few men were more different than Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford. Nixon had a history of playing dirty politics, earning him the label Tricky Dick. Gerald R. Ford Jr., on the other hand, was an Eagle Scout. The 1930 All-State center had it instilled in him by his coach to always play by the rules. His college yearbook described Ford as a man who never smokes, drinks, swears, or tells dirty jokes. And because he's not a bit fraudulent, we can't find anything really nasty to say about him. In the fall of 1935, Ford had the opportunity to play professional football, but turned down offers from both the Packers and the Lions. Instead, he worked his way through law school until the attack on Pearl Harbor, which inspired Ford to enlist in the Navy. While Nixon created many political enemies, Ford fostered deep and lasting friendships. In 1948, Ford ran for a congressional seat in Michigan. Members of his old 1930 state championship team from South High School campaigned for him, going door to door. It was after Ford's 48 campaign that his path first crossed with Richard Nixon's. The two Republicans served together in the House, and they quickly became friends. As a freshman congressman, Ford admired Nixon's intelligence. Many congressmen admired Ford's integrity. Unlike Nixon, who would viciously attack his opponents, Ford was known for reaching across the aisle. In 1963, Democratic President Lyndon Baines Johnson selected the Republican Ford for the bipartisan Warren Commission, which investigated President Kennedy's assassination. LBJ and Ford didn't always see eye to eye, of course. LBJ personally attacked Ford once, saying he had played too much football without a helmet, but Ford still won Johnson over. As LBJ later told him, "Jerry, you and I have had a lot of head-to-head confrontations, but I never doubted your integrity." Politically, too, Nixon and Ford were at differing ends of the Republican spectrum. In the election of 1964, Nixon had touted Barry Goldwater as a true conservative and had campaigned hard to help foster the growing conservative movement. Ford, a moderate, worried Goldwater was taking the party too far right. Ford thought the Republican Party should distance itself from conservative Southern Democrats, the very people Goldwater and Nixon were courting. Ford had been proven right when Goldwater suffered a crushing defeat against LBJ. Though the party had lost, the election of '64 consequently thrust Ford into the role of House Minority Leader, where he attempted to remake the Republican Party from inside the halls of power. Then, in the election of '68, Ford had been on the short list for Nixon's running mate, but Nixon ultimately chose Maryland Governor Spiro Agnew. Nixon had selected Governor Agnew as part of his Southern strategy to appeal to white Southern voters. Agnew had been a law and order governor. He had taken a hard stand against the civil rights movement, calling its leaders race-inciting, burn America down types. Meanwhile, Minority Leader Gerald Ford had sought to work with LBJ on civil rights legislation and fought against the obstruction tactics of some conservative Republicans. When Nixon won the presidency in '68, it had placed the moderate Ford and the more conservative Nixon on a collision course. Rather than working with Ford on policy, the Nixon White House dictated it. The president expected Ford to push a conservative agenda through the Democratic Congress. But when Nixon became embroiled in Watergate, his strong-arming of Ford would quickly turn into glad-handing, because the president felt he needed Gerald Ford to help pull his feet out of the fire. In June of 1972, when Ford learned about the botched break-in at the Watergate Hotel, Ford wondered how anyone could have been so stupid. When Ford learned that the break-in might be connected to the White House, he wanted answers. The minority leader marched straight over to John Mitchell, head of the Committee to Re-elect the President, or the CRP. When Ford confronted Mitchell and demanded the truth, Mitchell vehemently denied any CRP involvement in the Watergate burglary. Ford, for the moment, was pacified. But had Ford spoken with Martha Mitchell, his reaction might have been different. Martha knew one of the men arrested, James McCord, worked for her husband. McCord was the security coordinator for the CRP. He had once personally checked the Mitchells' apartment for bugs. McCord belonged to a group jokingly referred to as the Plumbers. They had formed in 1971 to plug leaks inside the Nixon administration. During the election of 1972, John Mitchell employed the Plumbers to spy on Democratic candidates George McGovern and Ed Muskie. And indeed, the CRP had orchestrated the botched break-in at the Democratic National Campaign headquarters at the Watergate Hotel. But John Mitchell was successful in convincing Gerald Ford and the American people otherwise. In November of 1972, Richard Nixon won re-election in an electoral landslide with a staggering 520 electoral votes. But by February 1973, just 1 month into Nixon's second term, the truth would come out. Watergate was a leak Nixon or his plumbers couldn't plug, and by early 1973, it threatened to sink his presidency. In February, the Senate created a committee to investigate Watergate. By May, they were holding televised hearings covered by all 3 major networks and watched by 85% of families with TV sets. The eyes of America were on Nixon.
We will inquire into every fact and follow every lead, unrestrained by any fear of where that lead might ultimately take us.
The televised hearings blew holes in the CRP's denials of involvement in Watergate. One by one, Nixon's staff was called to testify. Investigators were closing in on the president. GOP Senator Howard Baker of the committee asked what all of America wanted to know.
What did the president know, and when did he know it?
But the existing evidence didn't tie Nixon directly to either the crime or a cover-up for the moment. Nixon protected his loyal allies who promised to keep quiet. For anyone who actually testified against Nixon, it was their word against his. The president believed he was safe, until White House Deputy Assistant Alexander Butterfield dropped a bombshell.
Mr. Butterfield, are you aware of the installation of any listening devices in the Oval Office of the President?
I was aware of listening devices. Yes, sir. They were installed, of course, for historical purposes to record the President's business, and they were installed in his two offices, the Oval Office and the EOB office.
After the discovery of the Nixon tapes, the president knew he was caught red-handed. So Nixon played the only card he had left. He would stop the release of the tapes, and he would do it by claiming executive privilege. During the Watergate investigation, Ford cheered the defense from the sidelines. He believed his old friend Dick Nixon to be innocent. Ford encouraged Nixon to turn over the tapes, believing they would exonerate him. But in August of 1973, Minority Leader Ford, who had been contemplating retirement, would find himself pulled into the fold. In the midst of Watergate, the story broke that Vice President Agnew was involved in a political scandal of his own. Though Agnew denied it to Nixon, Agnew was accused of taking kickbacks from local contractors when he served as the executive of Baltimore County, as governor of Maryland, and as the country's vice president. In October 1973, President Nixon called Ford into his office. Ironically, Nixon told Ford that it was Agnew who was not to be trusted. He told Ford all the damning details of the case against Agnew. When the president asked his advice, Ford advised Nixon that in his opinion, the vice president should resign. Later that afternoon, Agnew did. Prior to Spiro Agnew's resignation, the country had been without a vice president 16 different times. But Agnew was the only vice president to ever resign because of a scandal. And Agnew's resignation was the first vice presidential vacancy after the newly passed 25th Amendment. Created after President Kennedy's assassination, the 25th Amendment empowered Nixon to fill the vacancy. Nixon considered his options. Texas Governor and former Democrat John Connally was a strong pick, but he was also well positioned to win the Republican nomination in the 1976 election. Nixon decided to keep him free and clear of Watergate. He considered liberal Republican Nelson Rockefeller and rising conservative star Ronald Reagan, but neither would be easily confirmed by Congress. Nixon needed someone in the center, someone loyal to him. But with a possible impeachment looming, Nixon needed a scandal-free politician, someone unimpeachable. On October 12th, Nixon nominated Gerald Ford. But on the same day, Nixon received damaging news. The United States Circuit Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia held that Nixon was required to turn over the tapes. Nixon would fight their release tooth and nail. Instead of handing them over, he would fire the special prosecutor in charge of the investigation. He would take the fight all the way to the Supreme Court to save his presidency, because Nixon knew when Americans heard the tapes, they would have their smoking gun, and his presidency would be over. Did you know you can skip ads and promos like these and listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game without interruption by subscribing at IntoHistory.com? And not only will you be getting the whole series ad-free and bingeable, but you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also ad-free, like Her Half of History. Because even though Hillary Clinton may not have made history when she ran for president in 2016, there have always been women who seized power, spied for their country, created artistic masterpieces, even escaped slavery. Her Half of History is perfect for all those who sat in history class and wondered, what were the women doing all this time? Because the answer is a lot. Get Her Half of History, Wicked Game, and many others ad-free at IntoHistory.com. Subscribe now at IntoHistory.com.
Hey, it's Jeremy from the new show American Criminal, and I'm popping in to tell you about another great show, Disgraceland. Disgraceland is an award-winning podcast that uniquely blends music, pop culture, and true crime with deeply researched storytelling and cinematic sound design. Host Jake Brennan tells the insane stories of musicians getting away with murder and behaving very badly. Stories about Jerry Lee Lewis, The Grateful Dead, Cardi B, Jay-Z, Jane's Addiction, Bruce Springsteen, Wu-Tang Clan, AC/DC, and so many more. Now, in 2024, after 6 years as the most downloaded music podcast in the world, Disgraceland is expanding to include stories from beyond the world of music. Stories of authors, artists, actors, athletes, true icons who possess dangerously compelling rock and roll hearts. New episodes now out on Anthony Bourdain, Andy Warhol, Peter Tosh, and Hunter S. Thompson. Episodes coming soon on Kobe Bryant, Bob Dylan, Basquiat, Jose Canseco, Van Halen, Bobby Brown, Garth Brooks, Chris Cornell, and more. Full episodes of Disgraceland are released every Tuesday with bonus after-party episodes released every Thursday. Check out Disgraceland on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, CastBox, or your favorite podcast app.
It's August 1st, 1974, in the U.S. Capitol building. Ford's chief of staff, Robert Hartman, paces the hallway, his eyes locked on the door to the vice president's Senate office. Hartman is so distracted he doesn't notice his cigarette has almost burned down to his fingers. Suddenly, the door opens, and out walks Alexander Haig, Nixon's chief of staff. Hartman tries to keep his cool when he passes, but Haig flashes him a smug smile. If he weren't in the Capitol, Hartman might just punch the smile right off his face. Hartman waits until Haig is gone, and then charges into Ford's office. All right, what the hell was all that about? Bob, I need you to set up a meeting with St. Clair. What the hell do you need to meet with counsel for? What's that jackass Haig up to? Hartman doesn't trust Haig or anyone else on Nixon's staff. When Haig asked for a private meeting with Vice President Ford, Hartman vehemently protested against it. But the vice president ignored him. Relax, Bob. Have a seat. I don't want to have a damn seat. I want to know what's happening. Well, close the door at least. Here, you might want to put that out before you burn yourself. Ford slides him an ashtray. Ford doesn't smoke. It's solely in the office for Hartman. Hartman pulverizes the cigarette. You should have listened to me, Mr. Vice President. You should never have been alone with him. He needed my discretion, and I was more than happy to give it to him. Hartman knows Ford is a good man. But the vice president is far too trusting, and in Washington, that can get a man in trouble. Hartman feels a duty to protect him. Well, what did he want from you? He said the whole ball game may be over, Bob. He asked me if I was ready. Ready for what? To be president. Oh my God. What the hell is on those tapes? I gave my word I would not say. But it's not good. It's only a matter of time now. Hartman knows Ford is not being hyperbolic. The House Judiciary Committee has already approved 3 articles of impeachment, charging President Nixon with obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and contempt of Congress. Worse, the Supreme Court has just ruled against Nixon's executive privilege to withhold the tapes. When the tapes come out, well, like you said, the whole ball game. So what now? Well, Haig ran me through the list of options the president is considering. You mean ways Nixon can avoid jail? There are several options on the table. And what's the best scenario? The president could agree to resign in exchange for agreement that the new president would pardon him. Meaning you, meaning me. And what did you say? I said I needed some time to think about it. I don't like that at all. Now, I didn't agree to anything, and Haig didn't try and push me into anything. But he mentioned the pardon option, and you sat there and listened? Silence implies assent, Jerry. You should have taken Haig by the scruff of the neck and the seat of the pants and thrown the hell out of your office. And then you should have called an immediate press conference and told the world why. Bob, you're overreacting, Bob. I've done nothing wrong. I have nothing to hide. After his meeting with Haig, Ford was in a tenuous position. He knew the truth about Nixon's guilt. He couldn't abandon Nixon because that would make it look like he was positioning himself for the presidency, nor could he get too close to Nixon. If he did, he might be sucked into the whirlpool. But Ford didn't see the impropriety of the meeting with Haig. Ford considered himself a man of incorruptible character. Hartman saw it differently. He was worried that the vice president had made a fatal mistake. The optics of the private meeting could call into question any decision Ford might make about a pardon down the line. Hartman feared that Ford's momentary lack of judgment would come back to bite him. On August 5, 1974, the withheld Nixon tapes were released. They were indeed a smoking gun, definitively proving Nixon had committed obstruction. It was the final nail in Nixon's political coffin. There was only one way to avoid impeachment and removal from office. Several days later, Nixon spoke to a nationally televised audience.
I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interests of America first. America needs a full-time president and a full-time Congress. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
Gerald Ford was never elected as president. He was never elected as vice president. So when he was sworn in as the 38th president of the United States, he became the only president ever to be appointed to the office. And he was appointed by the only president to ever resign the office in disgrace. Ford had an impossible task before him. He had to put the country back together and gain the trust the public had lost in government.
The oath that I have taken is the same oath that was taken by George Washington and by every president under the Constitution. But I assume the presidency under extraordinary circumstances never before experienced by Americans. I am acutely aware that you have not elected me as your president by your ballots. If you have not chosen me by secret ballot, neither have I gained office by any secret promises. I have not campaigned either for the presidency or the vice presidency.
Ford had not campaigned for the office, but he would immediately begin campaigning to keep it in the 1976 contest. Former Vice President Spiro Agnew had been Nixon's heir apparent, but he had resigned in disgrace too. So with Agnew out of the picture, most Republicans, including Ford, had expected Texas Governor John Connally to win the party's nomination in '76. But then Connally got caught up in a scandal of his own. Connally's indictment for bribery, perjury, and conspiracy left the Republican Party without a clear frontrunner. When he was chosen as vice president, Ford had promised Nixon that he had no interest in running for president. But Watergate wreaked tremendous havoc on the Republican Party. Democrats were well positioned to deliver an electoral reckoning. Republicans took their first shot across the bow when Ford's own vacant seat in Michigan went to a Democrat. So Ford began to see himself as the Republicans' only hope for success in 1976. But as he finished up Nixon's term, he would have to prove himself to his party and to the nation. But the first two decisions Ford would make as president would destroy any clear path he had to the Republican nomination and to a second term. The question of a Nixon pardon weighed heavily on Ford. He worried that a long criminal trial of the former president would be damaging to the country. It would also ruin the Republican Party's hopes of winning in '76. And on a personal level, he hated seeing how Nixon was deteriorating physically and mentally. On September 8, 1974, Ford issued Nixon a full and unconditional pardon. Ford's first major action as president ignited a wave of protest. When word got out about his private meeting with Nixon's chief of staff, there were accusations of a deal having been struck with Nixon. A Time magazine poll showed over 70% of Americans were skeptical about the pardon. A week later, his approval rating plummeted from 71% to 50%, the steepest decline in presidential polling history. And Ford was called before Congress to defend his action. In the midterm elections of 1974, Republicans took a massive electoral hit. 5 Senate seats and 49 House seats were lost to the Democratic Party. Ford's pardon of Nixon threatened to decide the presidential election of '76 before it even began. Ford's second controversial decision was his pick to fill the vice presidential vacancy. When Ford nominated liberal New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller, conservative Republicans cried foul. They were incensed that Ford would pick someone so liberal, but Ford had his reasons. With Congress in Democratic control, Rockefeller stood the best chance of an easy confirmation. Ford also believed Rockefeller would bring much-needed executive experience to his administration. And though he had not declared it publicly, Ford was setting the table for his run in '76. He had hoped the liberal New York governor would widen the ticket's base by attracting labor organizations, African Americans, and Hispanics. But Ford's plan backfired. In the aftermath of Watergate, the confirmation of Rockefeller became a political football for the Democrats, teed up for the kicking. And for conservative Republicans, it became a rallying cry. While Ford's pardon of Nixon split the country, Ford's choice of Rockefeller fractured the Republican Party. The conservative wing of the party revolted, ending any chance Ford had of a clear path to the nomination. That challenge was led by California Governor Ronald Reagan. The Hollywood actor turned politician espoused much of Barry Goldwater's brand of conservatism. But where Goldwater had failed to attract voters in his bid for president in '64, Reagan's optimism and charisma made conservatism much more palatable. Reagan called for massive tax cuts and an end to what he called burdensome entitlement programs. Newsweek called him the most kinetic single presence in American political life. When the Conservative Political Action Conference met in February of '75, they threatened to run Reagan as a third-party conservative candidate. It was Reagan himself who dismissed the idea. To a crowd of rebellious conservatives, Reagan challenged, "Is it a third party that we need, or is it a new and revitalized second party?" Reagan felt that the best hope for conservatism was to take control of the GOP, and that meant wresting the reins from Gerald Ford. On July 8, 1975, Ford formally announced he would run for re-election in '76. A letter of support for President Ford's nomination received signatures from 113 of the GOP's 145 representatives and 31 of its 38 senators. And then, in a move of political grandstanding, or perhaps playing defense, Ford offered Reagan a cabinet position in his next administration. But in the fall of '75, Reagan was in good position to say thanks, no thanks. Instead, Reagan went on the attack. He had plenty to criticize, and he did so on a fiery speaking tour. Reagan hammered Ford on foreign policy. Tensions were high in the Middle East as Greece and Turkey, two NATO members, were at each other's throats. And the Cold War still loomed large. In the spring of 1975, the U.S. had been humiliated when South Vietnam fell to Northern forces. In July of that year, Ford had made a failed diplomatic trip to Russia, which Reagan decried as selling out to the communists. Domestically, Reagan pointed to double-digit inflation, rapidly rising unemployment, and a struggling auto industry. Reagan also lambasted the Roe v. Wade decision, which effectively decriminalized abortions nationally. Reagan's attacks on the appointed vice president and accidental president were relentless. Making matters worse, in September of 1975, there were not one, but two attempts on Ford's life. Though Ford survived each of his would-be female assassins, it was perhaps Reagan's political attacks that did the most damage. Ford's approval ratings cratered to 34%. By November of 1975, Ford was at risk of losing his party's nomination. So the former football player called an audible. In that same month, Ford announced that his liberal vice president Nelson Rockefeller requested to be dropped from the 1976 ticket. Publicly, Ford tried to make it look like Rockefeller's decision, but in truth, Ford had asked Rockefeller to step aside to placate the many conservatives who distrusted Rockefeller's liberal version of republicanism. Ford also cleaned out holdovers from Nixon's administration, replacing them with men who would become staples in modern Republican administrations: Donald Rumsfeld, George H.W. Bush, and Dick Cheney. But these political moves did little to stave off Ronald Reagan. For Reagan and Ford, the primary was nothing short of a turf war. But Reagan wasn't the only person relentlessly attacking the president. Throughout the election of 1976, one of the most damaging attacks on Ford would come live from New York. It's Saturday night. Did you know you can skip ads and promos like these and listen to all episodes of American Election's Wicked Game without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com? And not only will you be getting the whole series ad-free and bingeable, but you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also all ad-free, like Wild West Extravaganza, a journey back to the fascinating, tumultuous, and often violent world of the American Old West. From famous outlaws like Billy the Kid and Jesse James, to lawmen like Wyatt Earp and Wild Bill Hickok, to trailblazing pioneers and frontiersmen, Wild West Extravaganza tells the true stories of the real-life characters who shaped this iconic era. So saddle up and discover the true history of the American frontier, the good, the bad, and the ugly, ad-free at intohistory.com. Icebergs, jagged rocks and rocky straits, mutinies, misfortune, and broadside battles. There are more tales of the sea than survivors to tell them, but the podcast Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs is doing a good job, and you can listen to all episodes of that podcast plus many others, including American Election's Wicked Game, without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com. Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs is one of my favorites from last year, a podcast about the greatest mishaps, misfortune, and misadventures of the sea. You'll hear stories of corruption, greed, bad intentions, and just plain horrible decision-making that resulted in some of the worst maritime disasters from all over the world. And some of these are more recent than you think. All episodes are ad-free, including bonus content and more at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com. It's April 16th, 1976, and President Ford walks briskly through the White House. Since taking office, he's barely had a moment's rest. But today his mind is not focused on the affairs of state. His thoughts are fixed on a massive blunder that happened last summer. Back in June of '75, after Air Force One touched down in Austria, Ford slipped coming down the stairs, and ever since then the press hasn't let him forget it. After a year of ridicule today, Ford hopes to rehabilitate his image. When he opens the door to the Oval Office, there's a film crew waiting. Sorry to keep you waiting, gentlemen. Not at all, Mr. President. We know you are a busy man. I'm the director, Gary Weiss. Nice to meet you, Gary. The two men shake hands. Though the president smiles, he's not happy to be making this recorded statement. But his election may depend on it. This is an opportunity for Ford to mitigate the damage from his very public slip and to dish out a little flack to the very man who's been doling it out. Weiss gestures to a man standing nearby in the Oval Office. I believe you've already met my colleague, Mr. President? I sure have. How could I forget? We met at the Correspondents' Dinner last year. Weiss's colleague gives Ford a funny look as Ford grips his hand tightly and looks him dead in the eye. Chevy, how are you? Comedian Chevy Chase is the one who's been ridiculing Ford with a scathing impersonation for months. But President Ford's about to feel even more ridicule. Because Ford is mistaken. This man is not Chevy Chase. I'm actually Lorne Michaels. I'm the producer. Oh, my mistake. I thought you were him. His foot squarely in his mouth, Ford releases his grip on Michaels' hand. Michaels moves the president to his mark. Well, we appreciate you doing this for us, Mr. President. These are trying times. I think this is what the American people need. Sensing the president's unease, Michaels tries to lighten the mood. Mr. President, if this works out, who knows where this could lead? You could really go places. Ford forces a smile, but in truth, he's sweating bullets. This is a big risk. If this doesn't go as planned, it could hurt him in the polls. Gary Weiss puts a microphone on the president's lapel. Your press secretary gave you the script? Yes, he did. Do you need a moment to look at it? No, I think I have it down. Well then, let's take it with the first line. Whenever you're ready, Mr. President. And rolling. Ford tries the statement a few times, but he feels absolutely wooden. Weiss has him try it several more times, but it's not getting any better. Ford can tell the director is getting frustrated. Forgive me. Mr. President, I just need you to loosen up a bit. Take a deep breath, relax, and we'll try it again. Crew member dabs sweat from Ford's forehead. Then the director signals the cameras to roll again. One more time, Mr. President, but this time, say it with a bit more feeling. Ford takes a deep breath, smiles, and looks right into the camera.
Live from New York, it's Saturday night.
After President Ford's fall down the stairs in Austria, Saturday Night Live viciously lampooned him on national television. Ford was arguably one of the more athletic men to ever serve as president, but Chevy Chase made the former football star look accident-prone. Chase's klutzy caricature and his over-the-top pratfalls wounded Ford's pride. But in a massive PR blunder, Ford's press secretary Ron Nesson convinced the president to embrace the moment. Nesson personally offered to host Saturday Night Live, making him the first political figure to host the show. Nesson then talked Ford into filming several pre-recorded cameos. But the SNL episode was disastrous to the president's image. The only thing to fall more than Chevy Chase was the president's poll numbers. Going into the Republican National Convention of August 76, there was no clear frontrunner. Ford was on the ropes, but he was still standing. Reagan attempted to throw one last haymaker to win the nomination. He shocked delegates when he announced liberal Senator Richard Schweiker as his choice of running mate. But rather than gain moderates, he lost conservatives. Ford won the Republican nomination on the first ballot. Kansas Senator Bob Dole was chosen as the vice presidential nominee. After Ford's acceptance speech, Ronald Reagan took the podium and gave a concession speech which far overshadowed the Republican nominees. Many left the convention wondering if they had bet on the wrong candidate. For the Democratic Party, the 1976 primaries had been a free-for-all. But the crowded Democratic field had cleared the way for an unlikely choice, former Georgia Governor Jimmy Carter. Carter was practically an unknown in Washington, D.C. He had served one term in the Georgia State Senate and one term as governor. But in 1976, Jimmy Carter benefited from a massive change in the presidential nominating process. Prior to the 72 election, the McGovern-Fraser Commission, formerly known as the Commission on Party Structure and Delegate Selection, created a new, ostensibly more democratic set of rules for the nomination process, which increased the role of state primaries, took power away from party insiders, and gave it to the people. Were it not for this change, Carter likely wouldn't have stood a chance. Many Democratic Party insiders did not want Jimmy Carter or his liberal ideas. His detractors rallied behind what was called the ABC campaign, anyone but Carter. But thanks to the new rules for delegate selection, Carter rode the momentum of his grassroots campaign all the way to the July 76 convention. There, despite the best efforts of the ABC detractors, Carter won the nomination on the first ballot. Senator Walter Mondale of Minnesota was chosen as his running mate. Jimmy Carter's best asset was being a Washington outsider, and Carter was no stranger to being on the outs. Back in 1954, after the Supreme Court had ruled segregation illegal, Carter had celebrated the decision. But his hometown of Plains, Georgia, felt differently. They organized a white citizens council to fight integration. Carter was the only white citizen in Plains who had refused to join. The town reacted by boycotting his business and banning him from the local country club. But Carter stood by his conviction. As chairman of the local school board, he had pushed to have the schools integrated. Like Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter was a man of principle. He ran a campaign centered on honesty. "Trust me," he told the American people, "I will never lie to you." Ford, on the other hand, doubled down on his Washington experience. He launched a Rose Garden campaign, hardly ever leaving the White House. Instead, he hoped Americans would see him hard at work solving the country's problems. President Ford focused his campaign's message on fighting inflation. But as president, his Whip Inflation Now initiative, or WIN, had failed to fix the issue. Carter centered his campaign on the issue of rising unemployment. His populist posture resonated with the millions of Americans who were out of work, and his hopeful message spoke to blue-collar workers, Black Americans, the elderly, and the disadvantaged. By August, Ford was trailing Carter in the polls by more than 20 points. Ford's best chance to defeat the Washington outsider was to point to the Georgians' inexperience. In a last-ditch effort to make an electoral comeback, President Ford challenged Jimmy Carter to a series of televised debates. Ford hoped that, in the face-to-face contest with Carter, his own presidential experience would shine. Meanwhile, the Carter campaign was doing damage control. On Tuesday, September 21st, Playboy magazine released an interview it had done with Carter. In it, Carter had admitted to lusting after women. He said, "I've committed adultery in my heart many times." For many conservatives, this was far too much honesty. But Carter would fight back in the televised debates. Since July, Ford had been using America's bicentennial to bolster his presidential image. At the first debate, Carter refused to call his opponent Mr. President. Instead, he referred to him as Mr. Ford. Carter also asked that the stage be altered so that the 6-foot Ford would not dwarf him. Carter's fears came true, though. Not only did Ford hammer Carter's lack of experience in the first debate, but he physically dominated the petite Carter. Ford scored a much-needed victory and a much-needed boost in the polls. But it wasn't a final victory. In the second debate, Ford made a Chevy Chase-sized political stumble. He claimed that there is no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, and there never will be. Ford's denial of Moscow's presence in Eastern Europe was an egregious gaffe. To many, Carter was the clear winner of the second debate, and Saturday Night Live didn't let Ford forget it. In a sketch that weekend, actor and comedian Dan Aykroyd parodied the farmer boy Carter as Chevy Chase played the bumbling Ford. Chase capped off the mock debate with his signature Ford pratfall over the podium. Going into October 1976, the two candidates were neck and neck. But in the final stretch of the race, Jimmy Carter pulled ahead. In no small part because on October 15, 1976, Carter's running mate, Walter Mondale, faced off against Ford's running mate, Bob Dole, in the first ever vice presidential debate at the Alley Theater in Houston, Texas. The recent resignation of President Nixon drew particular attention to the importance of the vice presidency, so this debate was watched carefully. By most accounts, Mondale won the VP debate, but his victory was less about substance and more about style. Describing the debate, one journalist wrote that Mondale came off as presidential, but Dole seemed dark, brooding, sarcastic, even mean. That same journalist wrote that Dole reminded him of someone many Americans were ready to forget, Richard Nixon. In the end, though, Bob Dole's poor debate performance was not Ford's undoing. It was arguably Ford's controversial decision to pardon his predecessor. On that front, Saturday Night Live played at least a small role. Days before the election, producer Lorne Michaels reran an SNL episode which satirized Ford's pardon of Nixon. Michaels worried that the controversial pardon had been largely forgotten by American voters, and he wanted to remind them. At the polls, it seemed, Americans did not forget. Although Ford won 27 states to Carter's 23, Carter won 297 electoral votes and 50% of the popular vote. The victory made Carter the first Deep South Southerner to win a presidential election since the Civil War. Carter won the labor vote, the elderly, and the underprivileged. But in large part, Carter owed his victory to Black Americans. 95% of Black voters cast their ballots for Jimmy Carter, helping him beat Ford in key electoral states like Maryland, New York, and Pennsylvania. Ford, the only president never elected, did well with the wealthy and the well-educated, but it wasn't enough to beat Carter's populist message. Journalist Tom Brokaw would later say of Ford, "In many ways, I believe football was a metaphor for his life in politics. He played in the middle of the line. He was the center, a position that seldom receives much praise. When the game was over and the others received the credit, he didn't whine or whimper." On January 20th, 1977, on the steps of the Capitol, Jimmy Carter was sworn in as the 39th President of the United States. He asked the country to create together a new national spirit of unity and trust. He and his wife Rosalind shunned tradition and forewent a limousine. In keeping with Carter's everyman persona, he and his wife walked the 1.2 miles to the White House. When he arrived, he offered that his Secret Service agent led the way into the Oval Office. But it was not a gesture representative of Carter's graciousness. It was a moment indicative of his inexperience, because the Washington outsider did not even know where to find it. But as Carter moved into the White House, the battle for the soul of the Republican Party was just beginning. In 1964, the conservative platform of Senator Barry Goldwater had failed to attract American voters. In 68 and 72, Richard Nixon had advanced the conservative message, but it was overshadowed by an unprecedented scandal. Though moderate Republicans prevailed in 76, the Republican convention left many enticed by the optimistic message of conservative Ronald Reagan. So in 1980, in the midst of the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression and an unrelenting Cold War with the Soviet Union, Americans would find themselves in desperate need of optimism. This is episode 48 of American Elections Wicked Game, 1976, Unimpeachable. On the next episode, the election of 1980, President Jimmy Carter's fight to keep the White House is a trial by fire of domestic recession and international turmoil. Carter defends his presidency against the rise of a softer, more approachable brand of conservatism embodied by the skillful optimism and powerful charisma of Republican nominee Ronald Reagan. If you're a careful Wicked Game listener, you know in the credits I mentioned my friend Professor Greg Jackson and his podcast, History That Doesn't Suck. It's a great show. But one way it can doesn't suck even more is when you listen to it without ads. You can listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game, all episodes of History That Doesn't Suck, and all episodes of many more great history podcasts without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com. History That Doesn't Suck is a deeply researched chronological survey of American history from a trained academic who also knows how to tell a story. Plus, in addition to ad-free listening to one of the best American history podcasts out there, you get scores of bonus episodes at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com. This episode contains reenactments and dramatized details, and while in most cases we can't know exactly what was said, all our dramatizations are based on historical research. American Elections Wicked Game is an Airship production, hosted, edited, and executive produced by me, Lindsey Graham. Audio editing by Molly Bach. Sound design by Derek Behrens. Music by Lindsey Graham. Co-executive produced by Stephen Walters in association with Ritual Productions. Written and researched by Eric Archilla and Stephen Walters. Fact-checking by Greg Jackson and Ciel Salazar from the podcast History That Doesn't Suck.
There's no escaping Murder Most Foul in my new weekly podcast, Rabia Chaudhry Presents The Mystery Hour with the Alfred Hitchcock and Ellery Queen Mystery Magazines. I'll lead you into twisty mysteries that will keep you on the edge of your seats and guessing until the very end. Written by award-winning mystery writers, we bring you a new whodunit each week. Search for The Mystery Hour on your favorite podcast app and subscribe now to experience the thrill of the best mystery storytelling in the world and let the murder mystery begin.